He could not see the barn. He could not see anything, just white in every direction and the wind that would not stop. Cole Hargrove had survived 4 years of war. He was not afraid to die. But standing in that Montana blizzard with a 6-week-old foal trembling against his leg, he understood for the first time what fear actually felt like. Not fear for himself, fear that she did not know yet, fear that he would be gone before she did. This is the story of how he got there and the woman who walked straight toward him when no one else would. A ranch does not lie. That is the first thing you need to understand before any of this makes sense. A man can lie. A town can lie. A newspaper advertisement written in careful, measured words can be the most polished kind of lie there is. But the land itself, the soil a man works with his hands, the fence posts he drives into frozen ground at 4 in the morning. When no one is watching the barn, he builds bigger than his own house. Because he understands what matters most, that land will tell you everything you need to know about the person who chose to stay on it. Hargrove Ranch sat in a valley below the northern face of the Rockies, cradled by the bend of a creek called Hunter Creek, which ran cold and clear even in the hardest months of a Montana winter. The sycamores along its banks had already gone bare by November of 1872, their pale limbs reaching upward like the arms of old men at prayer. The cabin was built from lodgepole pine, cut right off the hillside, notched and fitted without a single board wasted. It was not a beautiful structure in any way that a painter would stop to capture. It was better than beautiful. It was honest. Every plank sat where it needed to sit. Every hinge worked the way a hinge was supposed to work. The roof had been re-shingled 3 years running, not because it leaked, but because the man living under it believed that you repaired things before they failed rather than after. The barn behind the cabin was twice the size of the cabin itself. That told you everything else. Josiah Hargrove had homesteaded this valley in 1858, arriving from Ohio with 4 horses, $200 of Scottish stubbornness that could not be reasoned with, and a wife named Rose who was possibly the only person on earth who could occasionally outwork him. He drove fence posts and strung wire and built the barn before he built his own bedroom wall. He ran cattle through land that other men said was too cold and too remote and too far from anywhere that mattered. He proved all of them wrong, not by arguing with them, but by simply remaining while they left. Josiah taught his 3 sons one thing above all others. He said it so often it became less a lesson and more a fact of nature, like the direction of the wind or the weight of snow. He would say it at the dinner table. He would say it while they worked alongside him in silence. He would say it in the dark, last thing at night, as if he was afraid one of them might forget it in their sleep. He would say the land does not belong to you. You belong to the land. Your job is to give back more than you take. Josiah Hargrove died of a failing heart 7 years before this story begins. His wife Rose stayed on 3 years after that, and in those 3 years she kept the cabin warm in a way that had nothing to do with the wood stove. She kept the table set for 4 even when 1 chair was empty. She kept Sunday mornings sacred and Friday evenings loud. And she made sure that 3 grown men who were becoming too comfortable with silence still remembered how to be brothers rather than simply partners who happened to share a roof. When Rose passed, the thing she left behind was not an empty chair. It was the quiet. 3 men in a house generate a particular kind of silence that builds slowly the way ice builds on a window. You do not notice it one day. You notice it 1 winter later when you realize you have stopped calling it home and started calling it the ranch, as if the word itself has narrowed down to its function and forgotten whatever else it used to mean. Cole Hargrove was 35 years old in November of 1872, and he had been carrying that silence for 2 years. He rose before anyone else on the ranch, which was saying something, because Reuben, whom everyone called Rue, was not a late sleeper, and Beck had the schedule of a man who did not trust the morning to manage itself without supervision. But Cole was already outside in the dark before either of them stirred, already working the west fence line, before the sky turned from black to the particular shade of gray that comes just ahead of the sun. He did this not because he was proving anything to anyone. He did it because he did not sleep well, and he had learned long ago that a man who cannot sleep has 2 choices. He can lie still and let his thoughts find him, or he can get up and give his hands something to do before his mind can start in on the rest of him. Cole had made his choice years ago. He made it somewhere in Virginia in 1863, and he had not revisited it since. Reuben Hargrove was 31, and he fed the horses every morning while talking to them, not because he believed the horses were listening in any meaningful sense, but because he felt it was the polite thing to do. You were about to take something from a creature, namely its time and its labor, and the least you could do was acknowledge it as a living thing first. Rue knew the name of every person in Cedar Falls and could tell you their children's birthdays without consulting a calendar. He was the reason strangers became neighbors, and neighbors became the kind of people who helped you pull your wagon out of a ditch at midnight. This was not strategy. It was simply who he was. Beck Hargrove was 27, and he sat at the kitchen table every morning with the ranch's account books open before him, a cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow, because he kept forgetting to drink it when he was working through a column of numbers. Beck read people the way other men read weather, quickly, accurately, and with a strong preference for getting it right the first time, because being wrong about either one could get you killed out here. He trusted slowly. But when Beck Hargrove decided to trust someone, that decision did not come undone. Breakfast that morning, like most mornings, was Rue's responsibility and Rue's disaster. Venison hash was something that had started life as biscuits and ended up somewhere between bread and regret. Cole said 2 words. Rue said 3 back. Beck did not look up from the accounts. This was Hargrove Ranch at the start of it. This was what had existed before the letter arrived, and before the woman who wrote it stepped off a stagecoach in Cedar Falls on a cold Tuesday in the second week of November and changed the mathematics of the whole operation. Cole had received 11 letters in response to the advertisement he had placed in the Denver paper 8 weeks earlier. He had not shown the advertisement to his brothers before submitting it. He had written it, read it once, decided it said what he needed it to say, and posted it without ceremony. Rue found out 3 days later when a response arrived at the post office, and Agnes Cooper behind the counter mentioned it in the particular tone she reserved for news she found interesting. Beck found out when he saw the first envelope on the kitchen table. Both of them looked at each other across the room and then went back to whatever they had been doing, because this was also how Hargrove Ranch operated. A man made his decision. You either helped him carry it or you let him carry it alone. 10 of the 11 letters were easily set aside. One woman from Missouri wrote 3 pages about her delicate constitution, which was not what Cole had asked for. A widow from Kansas seemed sensible until she included a list of 47 requirements for the property, which Cole read with increasing patience before folding it back into its envelope. A girl from Nebraska wrote in handwriting so lovely it looked like decoration, but the words beneath the beauty said almost nothing. The 11th letter came from Boston. It was 2 pages. The handwriting was neat but not decorated, the kind of handwriting that suggested a person who wrote frequently and practically rather than a person who was trying to impress anyone. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She was 22 years old. Her family had bred Morgan horses on a farm outside Boston for 3 generations. She had learned to ride before she learned to read, and she had attended her first foaling at 11 years old and had participated in somewhere near 50 of them since. Her father had died 2 years earlier, leaving the farm encumbered with debt her older brother could not manage, and the property had been sold within 6 months. She was currently living with her aunt in Boston in circumstances she described only as ones that could not continue. She was not asking for romance. She was not asking for a fairy story. She wrote, "I do not need you to love me. I need you to treat me as a person who knows how to work, not as an ornament or a burden requiring maintenance. If you can promise me that, I can promise you everything else." Cole read that last sentence twice during the first reading. He read it a 3rd time before he folded the letter and set it down. Here is the question that the story asks right now and does not answer yet. Why does a practical man read a sentence a 3rd time when he has already decided on his answer? A man like Cole Hargrove does not read things 3 times out of sentiment. He reads things 3 times because something in the words has caught on something inside him the way a splinter catches on cloth. Something small, something that will not let go. He went to sleep without answering that question. He woke before dawn and put the travel money in an envelope with Eleanor Whitfield's name on it and left it on the kitchen table. Rue saw it. Beck saw it. Neither of them asked. 8 weeks passed. Cole repaired the porch step that had been loose for 2 winters. He replaced the latch on the barn's east door. He cleaned the cabin in a way that suggested he was aware of what he was doing without being willing to admit it out loud. He told himself, not for the first time in his life, that this was a practical arrangement. 2 people, 1 ranch, a division of necessary labor. He was not the kind of man who had expectations. He was the kind of man who had requirements. And the letter from Eleanor Whitfield suggested she understood the difference. He was right about that. He was wrong about almost everything else. The stagecoach from Helena was due at Cedar Falls at 2 in the afternoon on the second Tuesday of November. All 3 Hargrove brothers drove into town together, which was not strictly necessary, but which no one chose to comment on. Cedar Falls was a settlement of roughly 50 souls when everyone was present and accounted for, with a general store run by Agnes Cooper, a small church with Reverend Hollis presiding, a doctor named Silas Warren with an office above the hardware merchant, and a hotel and dining room called the Frontier House that served decent coffee and unreliable eggs. Agnes Cooper was rearranging items on the shelving outside her store when the Hargrove wagon came through. She was not actually rearranging anything. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew she was not rearranging anything. Agnes Cooper was the town's primary intelligence apparatus, which she maintained by positioning herself near windows and doorways at moments of interest in performing small and necessary tasks. The 3 brothers stood at the edge of the platform near the stage road. Rue had marked his calendar 12 times and reminded Cole 6 times that morning about the schedule in the particular way of a man who has decided to be helpful and cannot be talked out of it. Beck had reviewed the ranch accounts the night before, not from anxiety, but from his need to know the state of every ledger before any new variable entered the equation. Cole stood with both hands in his coat pockets and looked down the road to where the stage would come from. And he looked like a man who was waiting for something he had requested without fully thinking through the requesting of it. The sound reached them before the sight did. The particular rattling percussion of a stagecoach over a frozen road. 6 horses working in harness, the leather springs groaning with the weight of it. Then the dust. Then the coach itself coming around the bend in the road that ran alongside the tree line, and John Hutchkins up on the box pulling the team to a stop in front of the platform with the efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times and was in no mood to make it 11,001. Tom Porter, riding shotgun, climbed down and opened the coach door. Ezra Johnson stepped out first, the dry goods merchant blinking in the cold light and reaching back for his sample case. Then Mrs. Caldwell, the doctor's wife, who began complaining about the road while she was still on the step and had not yet finished by the time she reached the ground. Then a young minister with a greenish face who gripped the door frame and breathed carefully through his nose. Then the hand. A small hand in a thin leather glove placed on the doorframe with the deliberateness of a person who had been sitting in a swaying box for 5 days and had made a decision about how they intended to arrive, regardless of what the 5 days had done to them. Eleanor Whitfield stepped down onto the platform of Cedar Falls, Montana territory. Cole had told himself he expected someone practical. He had told himself the letter had sounded like a practical woman and that practical was what the ranch required. He had told himself things that were not incorrect, but were nonetheless inadequate because they had not accounted for the particular way this woman stood after placing both feet on the ground. Not her appearance, her posture. The thing that registered first was not beauty, though she was that. What registered first was the way her spine straightened on contact with solid ground, as though she had decided before the coach door opened how she intended to carry herself for whatever came next. Her eyes moved across the platform once a single measured sweep, and it was not the look of a woman admiring scenery. It was the look of a person assessing terrain. She was small, perhaps 5 feet and 3 inches, wearing a navy wool traveling dress that had seen 5 days of hard road without quite surrendering to it. Her honey-colored hair was partly escaped from whatever had been holding it in place, a few strands lying along her temple in the wind. Her face had the high color of the cold in it, and her green eyes, when they finished their sweep of the platform and landed on Cole, were direct in a way that could not be described as anything other than purposeful. Cole felt something settle downward in his chest. Not a pleasant sensation. The sensation of a man who has made a calculation and has just realized the calculation was missing a variable. Rue made a sound beside him, a brief involuntary exhalation of surprise that he immediately converted into a clearing of his throat. Beck on Cole's other side went completely still. Eleanor Whitfield walked directly toward Cole, not toward the group of them, toward him specifically, as though she had already identified which one he was, which she had because she had asked for a description in her letter, and Cole had provided one in his reply with the same efficiency he applied to everything. She stopped in front of him at a reasonable distance and said, "Mr. Hargrove, Cole Hargrove." Cole remembered to remove his hat. "Yes, ma'am, I am." "Eleanor Whitfield." She did not extend her hand, not from rudeness, but because both of them understood that the formal theater of greeting was not the performance either of them had come here to give. "I noticed the way you looked at me when I stepped off the coach. If this is a mistake, now is the time to say so, before I ride another 35 miles to find out." Rue made the sound again. This time he did not bother converting it into anything. Beck's jaw did not move, but the left corner of his mouth shifted approximately 2 millimeters. Cole looked at the woman standing in front of him. Tired in a way, 5 days of hard travel will make a person tired. Coat dusty hair escaping the arrangement she had clearly attempted before stepping down and standing straight enough in the cold November wind that it was evident this was not a posture she was performing for his benefit. It was simply how she stood. The letter had said a person who knows how to work, not an ornament or a burden. "Not a mistake," Cole said. "But the ranch is not comfortable, Miss Whitfield. It is 35 miles from here with no close neighbors. The work is hard. Montana winters are not like anything you have known." "I did not come here for comfort," she said. "I came for honest work in a place I could call home." Rue could not contain himself. "Miss Eleanor, I am Rue, the second brother, and this is Beck, the youngest. Do not let his face concern you. He looks that way at everyone for the first 6 months." Beck exhaled with great patience. "That is not reassuring," Eleanor said. "It was not meant to be," Beck said. "It was meant to be accurate." Something in Eleanor Whitfield's expression shifted then. Not quite a smile, something that existed in the territory just before a smile and easing the particular relaxation of someone who has been braced for something and has found it slightly less terrible than anticipated. "Can we go?" she said, looking back at Cole. "It is getting dark, and I believe I saw snow in those clouds an hour west of here." Cole nodded and turned toward the wagon. It was at that moment, with Rue and Beck moving toward the coach to collect her trunk from Tom Porter, that Cole noticed it for the first time. A small detail, the kind that a man might not notice and a man like Cole would not forget. Eleanor Whitfield shifted her grip on the small leather bag she carried, pressing it against her side as she walked across the uneven platform. Not the grip of a woman protecting money, not the grip of a woman carrying something fragile. The grip of a person holding the one thing they had made sure to keep close through 5 days of travel and everything before that. Not because it was valuable, because it was necessary in the way that a person carries something necessary when they are not certain what will happen when they arrive, and they want to have it on their person regardless. Cole noted this. He said nothing. He would not say anything about it for some time. The ride from Cedar Falls to Hargrove Ranch was 35 miles of mountain road, the kind of road that makes conversation feel like an act of determination rather than something that happens naturally. But it happened. Rue occupied the back of the wagon with Beck and deployed himself in the role of helpful conversationalist with the thoroughness he brought to everything, which meant that the space between Cole and Eleanor on the wagon seat was not silence so much as a slightly more private version of the talking happening 3 feet behind them. Cole talked about the ranch the way he talked about everything plainly without embellishment in sufficient detail for the information to be useful. He described the herd, the water sources, the cycle of the seasons, the procedure during snowstorms for keeping livestock safe. Eleanor asked questions, and this was the first thing that separated her from what he had been vaguely anticipating. She did not ask the questions of a person being polite. She asked the questions of a person processing information. She asked about the water source in winter and whether Hunter Creek had ever frozen solid enough to require breaking. She asked about the breeding rotation for the horses. She asked about the procedure when a storm cut the road to town for multiple weeks at a stretch, and what they kept in reserve for exactly that possibility. She was, Cole realized, asking the questions of someone who was already planning. He told her about his father briefly in the way he told most things, about his mother Rose, about the friend he had lost, a man named Everett, who had been his closest cousin near enough in blood that they shared the Hargrove name, distant enough in the counting that they had run separate households on adjoining land. They had gone south together in 1861, and Everett had not come back in 1865. He did not say much about the war itself. He said almost nothing that could be classified as feeling. He described events. Eleanor listened with the particular quality of attention that does not require response, that understands when the telling is the thing and the asking would only interrupt it. She told him about the Morgan farm outside Boston. 3 generations of that family in that land, and then 1 generation of debt that her brother could not carry, and 6 months of selling, and 2 years of Boston, and her Aunt Clara, which she described as circumstances that could not continue. She mentioned Victor Harrington by name only once in passing, the way you mention a road condition that made the journey difficult without wanting to dwell on the specifics of the mud. Cole did not ask. He heard the flatness in her voice when she said the name, the particular blankness that a person constructs over something they are not ready to discuss, in a wagon on a road they have never traveled before. He let it go. He would not let it go forever. The sun was dropping toward the peaks when the wagon came over the last rise before the valley. Below them, spread out in the reddening late afternoon light, was Hargrove Ranch, the creek catching the last of the sun, the sycamores along the bank like pale guardians at the water's edge, the cabin with its stone chimney already sending up a thin column of smoke from the banked morning fire, the barn large and dark and solid behind it, the corrals to the side with the horses moving in that particular loose, unhurried way of animals that know they are safe. And behind all of it, framing the entire valley like a painting that was too large to be contained, the Rockies, with their first season of snow already settled on the high faces, burning orange and gold in the last light. Eleanor Whitfield had been quiet for the last half hour of the drive. Her eyes mostly closed, the 5 days of travel finally pressing down on her, the way exhaustion presses down when a person has been holding it back by will alone and the will has begun to ease. When the wagon came over the rise, she sat up straight. She looked down at the valley for a long moment without speaking. Cole watched her face from the side, the way you can watch a person looking at something when they don't know you're watching. Her expression did not do what he might have expected. It was not the polite appreciation of a guest looking at a host home and searching for something complimentary to say. It was the expression of recognition, the face of a person seeing something they have imagined in some form and finding that the actual thing is larger and more real than the imagining. "It is more beautiful than I expected," she said quietly. Cole had no answer for that. He had lived in this valley most of his life and had stopped seeing it the way a stranger sees it. He looked down at the ranch through her eyes for a moment and felt something catch in his chest that he could not immediately name. He drove the wagon down the hill without saying anything, but the thing in his chest stayed where it was. Inside the cabin, Eleanor set her trunk in the main room and looked around with the same measuring attention she had given the stagecoach platform in Cedar Falls, the road from town, the view from the rise. Cole could see her making notes not on paper but in the back of her eyes, the same internal accounting a person does when they are deciding how a space functions and what it needs. He told her she should rest. She said she would, and then she looked past him through the window at the barn. "The pregnant mare," she said. "Is she in the barn right now?" Cole stopped. "How did you know there was a pregnant mare?" "There is one moving differently from the others in the far corral." She had already begun rolling up her sleeves in the absent, habitual way of a person who has been rolling up their sleeves to work since childhood. "It is the gait. She is carrying low and her stride is shorter on the right side. She has adjusted for the weight. I noticed when we came down the hill." She looked at Cole directly. "Have you checked her today?" They walked to the barn together, Cole carrying the lantern he had lit in the cabin. The barn held the warmth and smell of livestock and hay and old leather, the smell of every morning of Cole's life. And Eleanor Whitfield stepped through the door and took a single breath, and her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. It was involuntary. She probably did not know she had done it. Cole noticed. Juniper stood in the end stall, a chestnut mare of 7 years, with the full, deep belly of a horse in the final days of her carrying. She was moving in a tight circle when they came in the small, restless circuit of an animal who cannot find a comfortable position. When Eleanor came to the stall, Juniper turned and regarded her with the dark, intelligent eyes of a creature making a decision. Eleanor raised her hand slowly from below, palm open, and held it at the edge of the stall without reaching forward waiting. Juniper stretched her neck and put her nose into Eleanor's palm. Eleanor began to speak to the mare in a voice Cole had not heard her use yet, low and even not quite a whisper, the kind of voice that carries calm, the way the smell of hay carries comfort. Her free hand moved to the mare's neck, then slowly to her flank. Then she crouched slightly and pressed both palms gently against the drum of the animal's belly, closed her eyes, and was still. Rue and Beck had followed to the barn door without quite intending to. They stood there watching. "She has dropped," Eleanor said without opening her eyes. "The foal is engaged. The position is good, but she is close. 48 hours at most, perhaps much less." She opened her eyes and looked at Cole. "Has she begun to wax?" Cole said, "since yesterday. And this morning she was more restless than usual." "Somewhat." "More than somewhat," Eleanor said. She straightened and brushed her hands along her dress front. "I grew up with Morgan horses from the time I was 11. I have attended something near 50 foalings." She said this without pride, the way you might say you have shoveled a barn or mended a fence, a fact about a life, not a claim about a self. "If tonight is the night you want me here, I can tell you that much." Rue turned to look at Beck. Beck did not turn back. But something in the set of Beck's jaw had changed. Not agreement, not yet. Something that in Beck Hargrove constituted the beginning of recalculation. Cole looked at this woman standing in his barn in a traveling dress with hay on her shoes, who had been on a stagecoach for 5 days and had identified a pregnant mare from half a mile away on a wagon seat. He looked at the way Juniper, who was not friendly to strangers, had her muzzle resting against Eleanor's shoulder. "If tonight is the night," Cole said, "I want you here." They ate supper in the cabin that first evening, a simple meal of stewed venison and the bread Rue had made that morning, which was honest food, if not refined food, and Eleanor ate it with the grateful attention of someone who had not had a hot meal in 5 days and was not inclined to be critical of what that meal was. The table talk was practical. It was the conversation of people who needed to understand the terms of an agreement before they could think about anything else. Cole told her the Reverend from town could be brought out within the next few weeks to formalize things once they had established that the arrangement was workable for both of them. He said this directly. Eleanor set down her cup and looked at him. "Cole," she said, using his given name with the small deliberateness of someone who has decided that formality would be a form of performance neither of them had time for. "I want us to be clear from the beginning. This is a practical arrangement between two adults. I am not bringing expectations beyond honest work and honest treatment. If after a month either of us finds that this is not working, I want to be able to say that." "So do I." he said. Rue raised his cup in a small private toast to no one in particular. Beck did not raise his cup, but he also did not lower it, which in Beck's vocabulary meant something close to agreement. Cole rose from the table and said he was going to check on Juniper one last time before dark. Eleanor rose with him. I will come, she said. She should know my smell before tonight, if tonight is the night. They walked to the barn together in the last of the cold light. Cole noticed that she matched his stride without effort, not falling behind, not hurrying, simply walking beside him the way a person walks when they are familiar with where they are going. She was not familiar with this barn. She was familiar with barns. It was the kind of night that arrives quietly. 2:30 in the morning. Cole was already awake, as he almost always was at that hour, lying in the barn's tack room where he had moved his bedroll for the duration. Eleanor had taken the storeroom as her own sleeping quarters from the first night, which was the arrangement she had proposed, and Cole had accepted without argument, the bedroom remaining as it had always been quiet and undisturbed. He heard Juniper before anyone else could have heard her. A sound that started low and built into something no one who has ever worked around horses can mistake the cry of an animal in distress. He was pulling on his boots before he was fully upright. When he reached the barn, the lantern was already burning. Eleanor was inside Juniper's stall. She had not gone for Cole or for Rue or for Beck. She had come directly here from the cabin because she had been listening, because that is what you do when a mare is close to her time. She was wearing a coat 3 sizes too large for her, which could only have been Rue's thrown over her sleeping clothes, and the boots on her feet were also not hers. Large and unlaced, and her hair was loose around her face, and she was crouched beside Juniper with both hands on the mare's side, and her face had a quality of focused calm that Cole had seen before in exactly one context in Men Under Fire, who had trained their body not to communicate what their mind was doing. She did not look up when he came in. The foal has one leg folded back, she said. If we cannot correct the position, we lose them both. I need more light, and I need soft soap from the tack room. Right now, please. Cole was already moving. He did not question the please. He did not question the instruction. He took the lamp from the hook at the stall entrance and shouted for Rue as he moved toward the tack room. And by the time he came back, Rue was in the barn doorway with another lantern, and Beck was at the stall door with the rope they kept for difficult foalings, which Beck had gone for without being asked, because Beck had already assessed the situation and identified what would be needed. Eleanor worked with her sleeves pushed past her elbows, and her jaw set in the way of a person who is spending all available attention on what her hands are telling her. Cole knelt at Juniper's head and put his hand on the mare's neck and began to speak to her in the low, steady voice he used with frightened animals, the voice he had developed in childhood and had never stopped needing. Juniper was trembling. She looked at Cole with the large, dark eyes of an animal who does not understand what is happening to her body and has found one thing in the room that feels safe, and she kept her gaze on him. Twice Eleanor withdrew her hands and flexed her fingers in the cold air, working the cramped muscles back into usefulness, and then put them back. She did not apologize for the time this was taking. She did not explain what she was doing. She was beyond explaining things. She was entirely inside the problem and the rest of the world, the cold, the straw, the watching men, the uncertain light existed only at the furthest edge of her attention. The leg is turning, she said at some point past 3 in the morning. Her voice was still steady, though Cole could see from the angle of her shoulders how much effort she was exerting. It is almost there. Juniper. She said the mare's name with the authority of someone who expects to be heard. With me, just like this. Almost. A sound from the mare that was not quite a cry and not quite a sigh. Now, Eleanor said, Cole the rope. Steady pull. Let her lead it. They worked together, Cole, with the soft rope looped in the way he knew, following the rhythm of the mare's effort, pulling when she pushed and easing when she rested, and Eleanor beside him with her hands guiding, speaking in that steady, low voice that seemed to carry meaning into the animal in some register that had nothing to do with language. One pull, the foal shifted. A second pull. The head appeared. A third pull, long and slow, and the foal came into the world in a rush of warmth and stillness onto the straw. The stillness lasted long enough for everything in Cole's chest to go cold. Then Eleanor was moving faster than a person that tired should have been able to move, wiping the foal's nose, rubbing the small body with a clean cloth in the firm circular strokes of someone who knows exactly what movement she is trying to encourage. And she was speaking to the foal in the same voice she had used for Juniper. And the voice was not frightened, and that fact kept Cole from panic in the way that a calm voice in a dark room keeps a child from believing the worst. 1 second, two, three. The foal shuddered, a small wet cough, then unmistakably the sound of a first breath. Eleanor sat back on her heels in the straw. Both her hands were trembling. She pressed them against her knees and looked at the foal, a small chestnut filly, beginning the process of understanding that she had a body, and that the body had legs, and that the legs were supposed to do something, and the whole project was going to require considerable work. "Oh, thank God," Eleanor said, barely audible. She was crying, not in the way of a person who has decided to cry, but in the involuntary way of a person whose body has been maintaining a degree of control for the last 45 minutes and has now decided that enough is enough. The tears ran down her face, and she made no move to wipe them away, and she laughed once, a sound of pure relief, short and low and completely genuine. Juniper raised her exhausted head and made a sound toward her foal. The foal answered with the thin, uncertain call of something new to the world. Cole watched all of this. He had grown up with livestock. He had attended difficult foalings before had lost animals. This way had known the particular grief of a barn at 4 in the morning when the night has gone wrong. He had never before this night watched someone do what Eleanor Whitfield had just done. Not with that precision, not with that patience, not with that absolute absence of drama throughout the doing of it, and then the one unguarded moment of relief at the end, as honest as the cry of the foal. "You did it," he said. His voice came out differently than he intended, a little rougher, a little lower. "Both of them are fine." Eleanor looked at him from where she sat in the straw, still not quite composed, coat too large and boots too large and hair loose around her dirty face. "We did it," she said. "You held her together." There was something else Cole wanted to say. He could not immediately locate what it was. The feeling in his chest had not settled. It had, if anything, become less manageable than it had been on the wagon seat looking at the valley, and he was not a man who found unmanageable feelings to be a comfortable experience. He looked away. He looked at the foal which had achieved the standing position on 4 legs that had no right to be trusted yet, but which were apparently going to try anyway. "She needs a name," he said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She reached out and let the foal sniff her fingers, and the foal did, and then bumped her small head gently against Eleanor's palm, as if she had already decided about this particular person. "Faith," Eleanor said. "It seems right. I was not sure we could do it." And then we did. Cole tried the name in his mind. Faith. A small chestnut filly on unsteady legs in a coal barn in November alive, because of a woman who had been on a stagecoach 5 days and had come here with a small leather bag held close to her side and a 2-page letter full of sentences that did not waste words. "Faith," he said. "All right." When dawn came, the 4 of them stood outside the barn with cups of coffee Rue had made while Cole and Eleanor were washing up at the pump. Eleanor could not quite manage the pump handle, her hands too cramped and cold from the hours of work, and Cole operated the pump while she scrubbed her arms without being asked to, and without making anything of it. The valley was very quiet. The sky in the east was the color that comes before color, a gray that is almost blue, and the mountains were beginning to define themselves against it. Cole could feel the specific exhaustion of a night spent entirely awake, not the ordinary tired of hard work, but the particular hollowness of a night that required everything. Rue was talking because Rue was always talking, but quietly for once the volume calibrated to the hour and the mood. Beck stood to Cole's left and said nothing, which was his standard condition, except that his gaze had moved in the last hour from Eleanor, and back to the barn in a cycle that Cole recognized as the outward sign of Beck revising something. It was Rue who saw it first. He had the habit of looking at the horizon, something a man develops when he grows up in open country, an automatic scan of the distances, not looking for anything in particular, just looking because it was always better to see something early than late. Hey, Rue said. The word came out differently than his usual words, smaller. Is there somebody standing at the tree line? All of them looked. At the edge of the pine forest on the western slope, perhaps half a mile from where they stood, a rider sat on a horse. Still, not moving. The light was too early and the distance too great to read a face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A person on horseback positioned where the trees met the open meadow watching the ranch. Watching with the deliberate stillness of someone who had been there long enough to have chosen a position and had no intention of being quick about it. As the four of them looked, the rider turned the horse and walked it back into the trees and was gone. Beck looked at the leather bag Eleanor was holding in her left hand, the small, battered, carefully maintained bag she had carried since Cedar Falls, the bag she had pressed close to her side on the wagon ride. He looked at it with an expression that was not suspicion exactly, something more careful than suspicion, something that asked a question he was not yet prepared to put into words. Eleanor was not looking at the tree line. She was looking at Faith through the open barn door, the small filly pressed against her mother's side in the warm straw. But her shoulders had gone tight in a way that was different from the cold, the particular tightness of a person who has heard something they already knew was coming without knowing exactly when it would arrive. The valley was quiet again. The sky was turning. A rooster somewhere behind the cabin began to announce the morning. No one said anything about the rider, not yet. Some things needed to be said correctly, and correctly meant when the time was right and the time was not right yet. Cole looked at his ranch in the early light, the cabin, the barn, Hunter Creek catching the first pale gleam of the coming day. And beside him, a woman who had come here with nothing promised and had already changed the arithmetic of the night, who was holding a cup of coffee in hands that were still not quite steady, who had named a full Faith and meant it. He had thought he was solving a problem when he placed that advertisement in the Denver paper. He had not been wrong. He simply had not understood yet what kind of problem he was solving. The ranch had its own language, and Eleanor Whitfield learned it the way a person learns any language that matters, not from books, not from instruction, but from immersion in it, until the vocabulary of the place became her vocabulary too. She did not arrive and adapt herself to the rhythms of Hargrove Ranch. That would have been the wrong way to describe what happened. What she did was more precise than adaptation. She walked through the first 3 days with the careful attention of someone who understands that every system has a logic and that the respectful thing, the intelligent thing, is to understand the logic before you begin to modify it. She watched. She mapped the sequence of the morning chores in the particular order in which Cole preferred to address them, an order that was not arbitrary, but was in fact the most efficient arrangement for a ranch of that size. She noted which of the mares was being underwatered. She found the weak section of the east garden fence and measured it with her eye, and wrote down on a scrap of paper the materials it would require to fix. On the fourth morning, she tacked the paper to the door of the tool room. She did not discuss it with anyone. She simply tacked it there and went about her work. And when Cole found it that afternoon and read it, and went to inspect the fence and found that she had identified the problem precisely and had also correctly estimated what was needed to address it, he stood in front of that section of fence for a moment and then went back to the barn and said nothing about it to anyone. This was how Rue figured out the situation. Rue had an instinct for people that was less a talent than an orientation, the way some dogs know before a storm. He read the particular quality of Cole's silence at the fence, and he went to check the paper on the tool room door himself, and then he went to find Eleanor, who was in the barn adjusting the feeding schedule for Juniper and Faith based on calculations she had made about what a nursing mare of that size needed after a difficult foaling, and he brought her a cup of coffee without being asked. Eleanor looked at this coffee and then at Rue. "I am not fragile," she said. "I know that," Rue said. "I brought it because you are doing something useful, and I wanted an excuse to watch." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she took the coffee And somewhere in that exchange, something was decided between them without words, in the way that the most important decisions between people are often made. By the end of the first week, Rue followed Eleanor through the barn the way a large, enthusiastic dog follows a person it has decided is worth following. Not underfoot, not demanding, simply present. He asked her questions about Morgan horses. He asked her about Boston, which she answered with a caution she did not apply to the horse questions. He told her stories about Cedar Falls with the energy of a man who has collected a great number of stories over the years and is simply waiting for an audience that will do them justice. She laughed twice in that first week. Both times at something Rue said. Both times the laugh was short and genuine and surprised, as if it had escaped before she could decide whether to allow it. Cole heard the second one from across the corral and did not look up from the fence post he was working on. Beck was more careful. Beck was always more careful. He was not hostile. Hostility was not the right word for what Beck brought to his observation of Eleanor Whitfield in those first days. The word was wariness, which is a different thing entirely. Wariness is what a man develops when he has seen enough arrivals and departures to know that the arriving is always accompanied by hope, and the departing is always accompanied by the particular aftermath of hope that has been incorrect. Beck had been 11 years old when the last hired woman had left the ranch after a single winter. He had been 14 when the second one left after a single autumn. The pattern had made itself clear early, and Beck was a person who attended to patterns. He watched Eleanor work. He watched the way she moved in the barn, the fluency of it, the absence of any hesitation that would have betrayed unfamiliarity. He watched the way she spoke to Faith, the foal they had named for a night's uncertain outcome, with the directness of someone speaking to a young creature that needed information rather than comfort. He watched how she handled Juniper, who had not been handled easily by anyone other than Cole since she arrived at the ranch 3 years ago. The moment that changed Beck's wariness into something else came on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of the second week. He was crossing from the equipment shed to the barn when he saw Eleanor standing at the corral fence facing away from him, unaware of his presence. She was talking to Faith, who stood close to the fence on the other side, her small nose tipped toward Eleanor's voice. Eleanor was describing the spring. She was telling the foal about it in the same tone she used for practical information, unhurried with detail. She described the way the meadow grass came in on the south slope first, because that face caught the sun earliest. She described the sound of Hunter Creek in April, when the snowmelt came down from the high country and the water ran loud and fast over the rocks. She told the foal that by June she would be out in that meadow and the grass would come up past her knees and she would have no idea what to do with that much space. There was no one watching. There was no purpose to this conversation. It was simply something she was doing because it was something she felt was worth doing. Beck stood at the corner of the equipment shed and listened, and then he turned and went back inside and did not tell anyone what he had heard. But from that afternoon onward, he began to include Eleanor in the ranch planning discussions, not in the pointed way of a man making a gesture, but in the practical way of a man who is determined that a resource is being underutilized. The wedding happened on the last Sunday of November. Reverend Hollis made the drive out from Cedar Falls on a bright, cold morning, arriving in his small wagon with his Bible and his good coat and the particular expression of a man who has performed many ceremonies and has learned to read the room accurately before speaking into it. He looked at the 4 people in the cabin and at the fire in the hearth and at the table that Rue had set with a care that was evident in every placement, and he seemed to decide that something real was happening here, which was the only kind of ceremony he had any interest in officiating. The vows were spoken standing in the main room with the winter light coming through the windows, and Cole said his in the same voice he used for everything that mattered, which was steady and direct, and left no room for doubt about whether he meant it. He was surprised to discover as he said each word that he did mean it, not as a transaction, as a promise. Eleanor said hers more quietly but without hesitation. She looked at him throughout, in the green eyes that had swept the stagecoach platform in Cedar Falls, and assessed it as terrain did not look at him as terrain now. They looked at him as something else, something she had not yet named to herself or to anyone, and Cole was a man who could read a great deal in how a person looked at something. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Cole leaned forward and placed a brief, unhurried kiss on her forehead. Eleanor stood still for a moment and then turned to help clear the table, the color in her cheeks higher than the warmth of the room required. Rue wore an expression that he was clearly trying to moderate without success. Beck stood very straight and said nothing, which, in Beck's vocabulary, constituted ceremony. 30 minutes after the Reverend's wagon disappeared back down the ranch road toward town, all four of them were back at the afternoon chores. The work of a ranch does not pause for vows, and none of them would have wanted it to. It was Beck who found the letter. Not the next day and not the day after. It was the following week in the first days of December when Beck was making a repair to the hinge on the door of the small storeroom that Eleanor was using as her sleeping quarters. The floorboard near the base of the cupboard had come loose at one corner, lifting slightly when you stepped near it. Beck was on his knees addressing this not as an act of inspection, but as an act of maintenance, when the small leather bag slid sideways from the edge of the shelf above, and the flap came open as it fell. He caught it before it hit the floor. He looked at what had fallen partially out. A letter, rolled and tied. He could see enough of the letterhead to identify it without reading further: a Boston legal firm, the kind with 3 names and a reputation that preceded it across state lines. He saw the seal. He saw the name at the bottom, visible at the edge without unrolling. Victor Harrington. Beck placed everything carefully back the way he had found it. He stood up from his knees. He finished the repair to the hinge. He went out of the room, closed the door, stood in the hallway for the amount of time it took him to decide what to do with the information, and then went to find Cole. He did not tell it. He sat down across from his oldest brother at the kitchen table, and he wrote on a scrap of paper the name he had seen and placed the paper in front of Cole and said nothing. Cole looked at the name. He looked at Beck. "You are certain?" "I saw what I saw," Beck said. Cole sat with this for a moment. Then he stood, put on his coat, and went to find Eleanor. She was with Faith, which was where she spent a portion of every afternoon doing the patient groundwork of a person who understood that a young horse was a long project and that the quality of the beginning determined the character of everything that followed. She was teaching the filly to accept a hand along her neck and flank without shying, and Faith was attending to this lesson with the intelligent wariness of a young creature who is not yet sure whether the world is safe but is very interested in finding out. Cole stood at the stall door and said, "I need you to tell me about Victor Harrington." Eleanor's hands went still on the filly's neck. She did not look up immediately. When she did, the expression on her face was one he had not seen before in her, because she was a person who managed her expressions with considerable discipline, and what he was seeing now was the face underneath the discipline. Fear, not of Cole. Something older than Cole and larger, the fear that accompanies a thing you have been carrying for a long time and have hoped might not have to be set down in front of anyone. "How did you find out the name?" she said. He told her briefly about the letter. He told it without accusation because there was no accusation to make. She had not deceived him. She had simply not told him everything, and that was her right, and he was not her confessor. She set her hands in her lap and told him. She told him about her father's death and the loss of the farm and the 2 years in Boston with her Aunt Clara, who had meant well in the way that people mean well when they believe they know better and do not consider that knowing better might not be the same as knowing best. She told him about Victor Harrington, presented to her as an opportunity, a man of 48 who owned sufficient property in Boston and sufficient reputation in certain rooms to be described by her aunt as a very good chance. She told him how Harrington had conducted himself in the parlor of her aunt's house with the confidence of a man who had already concluded the negotiation. She told him what Harrington had said when her aunt stepped out of the room for a moment, that the arrangement had been agreed upon by the family, and he expected a wife who understood her position. She told him what she had done after that. She said it without pride and without apology. She had struck the man across the face with the flat of her hand, hard enough to be unambiguous. Her aunt had returned to find Harrington with his hand raised to his cheek, and Eleanor standing where she had been standing. Harrington said she had misunderstood a friendly gesture. Her aunt had believed him, or had chosen to believe him, which amounted to the same thing for Eleanor's purposes. She had been given a week to leave. She had found the advertisement in the papers her aunt kept around the house. She had written the letter that night and posted it the next morning. "The letter in my bag," Eleanor said, and her voice was as controlled as she could make it, "came from his lawyers. He is saying I violated a commitment that my aunt made on my behalf. He says he will pursue this." She looked directly at Cole. "I do not know what he can do legally, but I know he has money and men who will take that money to do things that money can arrange." Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at the stall door, and then at the hay, and then at Eleanor. And what he was doing was not performing thought, but actually thinking, which looked similar from the outside, but felt different on the inside. "You came here because you needed to run," he said. "Not an accusation, a fact being verified." "I came here because this was the only chance I had," she said, and the difference was important to her, and she made it clear that it was. "And because your letter sounded like the letter of an honest man. But yes, I also needed to go somewhere he could not easily reach." She held his gaze without flinching. "If that changes what this is, I need to know now." Cole stood up from where he had been leaning against the stall frame. He looked at the filly, who had resumed nuzzling Eleanor's palm, with the uncomplicated interest of a creature that has decided a person is trustworthy and is not interested in revisiting the question. "It does not change what this is," he said, "but we need to talk about what comes next, the three of us." She nodded once. The conversation that night after Eleanor had gone to her room was the shortest strategy meeting three men who had run a ranch together for a decade had ever held. Rue said they would protect her immediately and without qualification, because Rue was a man who had never learned to approach things indirectly when he already knew which direction he was going. Beck laid out the practical complications with the precision of someone who had thought through all of them. On the walk from the barn, Harrington had resources and legal standing in Boston, and what that meant in Montana territory was less clear but not irrelevant. A man with money could find ways to make a remote ranch uncomfortable even from a distance. He was not being pessimistic. He was being Beck. Cole listened to both of them and then said 6 words that concluded the discussion. "He said she is my wife, not the woman in the arrangement, not the woman who had come in response to the advertisement. His wife." The 2 syllables had shifted from description to declaration sometime in the previous 2 weeks, and Cole was not a man who said things he did not mean. Rue and Beck looked at each other across the kitchen table. "Right," Rue said, "so we handle it." Beck said nothing, which was his way of agreeing. The hill behind the ranch had 3 graves in it under a stand of white aspen that had lost its leaves for the season but retained the white paper quality of its bark pale and clear against the gray sky. Josiah Hargrove, Rose Hargrove, and the third marker, smaller, newer, cut from pine rather than the heavier stone of the first 2. Eleanor found it on a quiet afternoon in the first week of December from the window of the storeroom. She went to find Cole. "The graves on the hill," she said. "I would like to see them if that is acceptable." He looked at her in the particular way that meant he was deciding something. "Why, because this is my home now," she said simply without decoration. "And I would like to know the people who built it." They walked up together, and Cole did not talk on the walk, which was his standard condition, and Eleanor did not try to fill the silence, which was why Cole found her presence easier to be in than most people's. She was not afraid of quiet. She did not experience it as something that required repair. The aspens were very still. The ground was hard under the thin early snow. Cole stood a few feet back while Eleanor moved between the markers, reading each name in turn. She spent a moment at Josiah's marker and another at Rose's. Then she stood in front of the third. The name on it was Everett Hargrove. The year of death was 1869. The age at death was 22. "Your brother," Eleanor said. "A cousin," Cole said. "Near enough in blood that we had the same name, distant enough in the counting that we ran separate households. We grew up on adjoining land and were closer than most brothers managed to be." He paused, not for effect, but because the next part cost something to say. "Typhoid fever, 3 days. He was well on a Monday and gone by Thursday. Eleanor was still. There was nothing to do, Cole said, and the words came out without his having planned them, which was not how Cole Hargrove usually operated, and which indicated that something had shifted in him sufficiently to change the usual procedure. I stood there. I did not know what to do, and there was not anything to do. And I have been informed of that fact many times since by people who understand medicine. But knowing a thing and caring a thing are not the same weight. Eleanor turned and looked at him. Then she reached out and placed her hand over his hand. Not gripping, just placing. The way you might place your hand on the cover of a book that contains something important as an acknowledgement that the thing inside matters. Something inside Cole Hargrove moved. Not dramatically, not with any sound. More the way ice moves in a river in early spring, a shift that is almost imperceptible and yet changes the whole direction of the current. He talked. He did not plan to, and he did not do it for long, but he talked about Everett in a way he had not talked about him to anyone since the year it happened. About the particular quality of the loss, which was not grief alone, but the loss of the person who had known Cole before the war, who had carried in his memory the version of Cole that existed before all the things that changed a man. When Everett died, Cole had lost the only witness to a self that no longer existed anywhere in the world except in his own recollection. "You could not have fixed it," Eleanor said. Her voice was direct, not soft, because she understood that Cole was not asking for softness. Typhoid took everyone it wanted in those years, including people who had the best care available. I know that. You carry the guilt anyway. I do. She looked at him. Your mother would think you have done well here. I say that not because I knew her. I say it because the land tells you. And the land here says the person tending it cares. He looked out over the valley below. The ranch, the creek, the barn larger than the cabin because the horses were the priority, and everyone who built this place had understood what the priority was. He could not find an answer to what she had said, so he did not try to find one. He let it stand the way she had offered it as a fact rather than a comfort, which was the only way he was able to receive such things. They walked back down the hill together, and the distance between them was exactly the same as it had been going up, and it was also entirely different. Agnes Cooper did not often leave her store to bring news to a ranch 35 miles outside town. She was a woman who had built her enterprise on being the place that information came to, not the place from which it departed. So when her horse appeared at the Hargrove gate on a cold afternoon in the second week of December, all three brothers registered the fact before she had cleared the gate. Rue went out to meet her. She spoke to him quietly with the particular economy of a woman who has learned exactly how much information is required and does not traffic in excess. She handed him a folded note, looked past him toward the cabin once, and then turned her horse and went back down the road. Rue came back with the note folded in his hand and a change in his face that was not common on Rue's face. "There is a man from the east in Cedar Falls," Rue said. "Arrived yesterday on the Denver connection. Lawyer with him, and two other men who do not appear to be legal professionals." Cole said nothing immediately. He looked toward the western tree line, bare now against the winter sky, and thought of the rider they had seen at the edge of the pines the morning after Faith was born. A figure that had stood and watched, and then disappeared without haste. The watching, it turned out, had not been idle. The note had a name on it written in Agnes's hand, and the name was not necessary because all three brothers already knew it. Cole went to Cedar Falls the next morning alone because he needed to see the situation directly before making a decision about it, and he needed to do that without an audience. Victor Harrington was in the dining room of the Frontier House when Cole came through the town's main street. Cole saw him through the window the way you see something when you are not looking for it and then cannot look away. A man of 48 carrying the particular quality of Eastern money that comes from knowing that your clothing costs more than a month of most men's wages and being neither proud of this nor unaware of it. Beside him, a lawyer with papers already spread. And at a separate table, two men who were the wrong size and shape to be anything other than what Beck had predicted they would be. Harrington looked up through the window and saw Cole on the street. They regarded each other for a moment through the glass. Harrington's expression did not change. It did not harden or alarm. It settled the way a man's expression settles when he is looking at a problem he believes he already knows how to solve. Cole turned and walked back to the wagon and drove home. That evening, he told Eleanor and his brothers what he had seen plainly with no ornamentation. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she was sorry, and Cole said she had nothing to be sorry for, and she said she was sorry anyway, because the sentiment was honest, even if the responsibility was not precise. Beck analyzed the situation with the efficiency of someone who had been running financial risk assessments since adolescence. Harrington had money and Eastern legal connections. The two men with him were not there for decoration. The most likely strategy was incremental pressure. Small damages, rumors manufactured, inconveniences, things that could not be proven deliberate, and that accumulated over time into a weight heavy enough to produce the outcome Harrington wanted. He came here thinking he is dealing with a remote ranch and a woman without other options, Rue said. He does not know Cedar Falls, Eleanor said, and there was something in the flatness of her voice that was not despair but its opposite. Cole looked at her. No, he said, he does not. They sat with that for a while. Then Cole told his brothers what they were going to do, and the plan was not complicated because the best plans rarely are. They would not act rashly. They would respond to legal pressure with legal preparation. They would document. They would reach out to Marshal Conrad Tanner, who was a man of law and not of money, and who could tell the difference between a legitimate claim and a wealthy man using the machinery of legitimacy for another purpose entirely. And they would give Cedar Falls, which had known the Hargrove family for 14 years, the opportunity to be what it had always been when the need arose. They would wait for Harrington to make the first move, and they would not flinch when he made it. Eleanor looked at Cole across the table when the discussion was finished. She did not say what she was thinking. She did not need to. The blizzard came out of the north on a day that had given no warning. The sky was clear at breakfast. By midday, there was a quality to the air that Cole recognized, but could not explain to anyone who had not grown up in this country, a metallic tension, a pressure change the way light looks when it is about to become something else. He looked at the mountains and told his brothers to start bringing the animals in. They moved quickly. This was something they had done many times, and the three of them together had the ranch locked down in a sequence they did not need to discuss. The cattle into the sheltered pasture with the windbreak trees, the pigs, the chickens, the horses from the far corral into the barn. Eleanor was alongside them from the moment she understood what was happening, moving with the same competence she had brought to everything else on this ranch, since the first night anticipating the sequence filling the gaps without being directed. All of the horses were secured, or should have been. Faith had learned something in her 6 weeks of life that no one had quite reckoned with. Yet she had learned to open the latch on her stall door. She had done it twice already, both times in the spirit of investigation rather than escape. In both times she had been caught quickly and the latch had been reinforced. Rue had reinforced it again after the second time. He had done it in the morning before they drove into town, and he had done it quickly because they needed to leave. He had not quite secured it properly. The wind hit the barn full force at 3 in the afternoon, and Faith, 6 weeks old and encountering her first true Montana blizzard, made a decision that was understandable from the perspective of a young creature who did not yet know what blizzards did to young creatures who were outside in them. She pushed the latch and it gave, and she came out of her stall and went down the barn aisle and out through the open barn door into the white. Cole saw her go. He did not think about it. He handed the rope he was holding to Rue and went after her. He was 30 steps into the open before the wall of snow hit him. The blizzard had moved faster than any of them had anticipated, which was the nature of northern Montana weather. It did not negotiate, and it was not interested in your schedule. Within 2 minutes, Cole could not see the barn behind him. Within 5, he could not see anything at all beyond a radius of perhaps 6 feet in any direction. He found Faith by sound the particular small cry of a frightened young horse, and he got his hands on her halter and held her, and she trembled against him in the way of something very young that has just understood that the world is much larger than it appeared to be. He turned to go back. The ranch was gone. There was white in every direction, and the wind was coming from multiple angles simultaneously, the way it comes in the bowl of a mountain valley bending itself around the terrain. And Cole could not determine which direction was back, because the direction of the wind was no longer reliable, and he could not see the sun, and he could not see anything. He stood still. He held the filly against him. He thought with the discipline of a man who has been in situations that required discipline before, and who knows that panic is what kills you. He had fought in a war. He had lost men, and he had nearly been lost himself more times than he had told anyone about. He had stood in fields in Virginia with smoke so thick you could not see your hand, and he had been afraid, which was sensible, and he had managed the fear which was necessary, and he had survived. The fear he felt now in this Montana blizzard, with a 6-week-old foal trembling against his leg, was different from all of those fears. It was different because it was not about him. Eleanor was back at the ranch. Eleanor, who had come here 6 weeks ago with a leather bag pressed against her side and a 2-page letter full of honest sentences. Eleanor, who had brought faith into the world with hands that did not waver. Eleanor, who had placed her hand over his on the cold hillside and listened to things he had not said to anyone. Eleanor, who was now his wife in every sense that the word could carry, and not yet in a few of the senses that the word implied, and who would be a widow before the year was out if he did not find his way back through this white. He was not afraid to die. He had made his peace with the possibility of dying many years ago in a field in Virginia, and the peace it held. What he was afraid of, standing in the blizzard with faith pressed against him, was that he had not yet given Eleanor Whitfield enough reason to stay. That if he died in this meadow, she would have Rue and Beck in the ranch, in the financial security of the arrangement, and she would be practical about all of it, because she was a practical woman, and she might stay and work this land for the rest of her life without any of it ever becoming what he had started to believe it could become. He was afraid of leaving before the thing between them was finished. He had not known until this exact moment that he thought of it as a thing that was unfinished. He kept walking. He walked into the white, and he held the filly, and he shouted his own name once into the wind, not expecting anything calling toward whatever might be listening. He heard a voice, thin, determined, coming from a direction he had not been walking. He corrected his course, and he heard it again closer now. And then he saw the shape of a person in the white, not just a shadow, but a person. And the person was small and moving toward him with a rope in her hand, one end of which disappeared back into the white in the direction of something she had tied it to. Eleanor Whitfield walked up to him through the blizzard and put the other end of the rope in his free hand. Her face was covered with snow, and her eyes were narrowed against the wind, and she was wearing every layer she owned, and she looked at him the way she had looked at the mare, in difficult labor with a focus that had no room in it for anything that was not the immediate and necessary task. "Hold on to that," she said, "and follow it back." He held on to the rope. He followed it back. He led Faith along behind him, and Eleanor walked beside him with her hand on the rope as well, and the rope led them through the white to the shape of the cabin, and then to the porch post she had tied it to, and then they were inside. The door closed behind them. Faith stood in the middle of the main room, dripping on the floor, trembling less than she had been in the meadow, already investigating the space with the interest of a young horse who has been inside a building before and knows that buildings contain interesting things. Cole's legs gave out from under him. He sat down on the floor against the wall. He was shaking from cold and from the 40 minutes of controlled fear that had preceded this moment, and he let himself shake because there was no reason not to anymore. Rue came from somewhere in the cabin with blankets and set about applying them. Beck stood in the doorway to the main room and looked at Cole and then at Eleanor and then at Cole again, and the expression on Beck's face was the face of a man confirming something he had suspected for long enough that confirmation was almost a relief. Eleanor knelt in front of Cole. She was checking his face and his hands with the methodical attention of someone who knows what frostbite looks like in its early stages and is looking for it. Her own hands were cold but steady. "I am sorry," Cole said because the words came up before he could redirect them. "Do not be sorry," Eleanor said, still checking his fingers. "Be warm. Those come in a particular order." She went and got more blankets, and she got the hot water bottles from the kitchen shelf, and she applied all of it with efficiency while Rue poked the fire up and Beck disappeared to check on the livestock that were already secured. Then she sat down on the floor beside Cole, not across from him, but beside him close enough that her warmth was deliberate, and she put her hands around his still cold hands and held them. Faith found a corner and lay down and went to sleep because she was 6 weeks old and had just had the most significant experience of her short life, and she was done with being awake. They sat by the fire when the worst of his shaking had passed the two of them alone, the blizzard still loud against the walls, but beginning to lose its most violent energy. "I was afraid," Cole said. He said it with the directness of a man who does not dress things up because he has decided that dressing things up is a form of dishonesty that he is no longer interested in practicing. Eleanor waited. "Not of dying," he said. "I have been afraid of dying before in the war, and I managed it. This was different." He looked at the fire. "I was afraid that I had not yet given you enough reason to choose to be here, that if I did not come back, you would stay because the arrangement made practical sense, and the arrangement would never become what I had started to think it might become." A long silence. The fire. The wind outside diminishing. "When did you start thinking that?" Eleanor said. "I am not certain," he said. "Somewhere between the barn on the first night and the hill last week." Eleanor looked at the fire herself, at the particular way she looked at things when she was deciding something. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I have been careful about saying it because I have been unsure whether saying it would change the arrangement in ways I was not certain you wanted." "Tell me." "I do not know exactly when it happened," she said. "Perhaps the first night in the barn when I understood how you spoke to a frightened mare. Perhaps on the hill when you told me about Everett without being asked. Perhaps when I understood how you had maintained this place alone without letting it become merely a place you endured." She paused. "But I am not here for the arrangement anymore. I have not been here for the arrangement for some time. I am here because you are here, Cole Hargrove, and because this has become home in the way that I had stopped believing anywhere could become home again." Cole turned and looked at her, the fire on the side of her face, the green eyes that had swept the platform in Cedar Falls like a scout reading an unfamiliar valley, and that were looking at him now with no calculation in them at all. He reached out and took her hand, which was small and cold, and had 6 weeks ago helped bring a foal into the world in a cold barn at 3 in the morning. He held it. Outside, the blizzard was beginning to quiet. The wind shifted from a howl to a low, steady sound, the sound of something that has spent itself and is now simply moving through rather than fighting. Inside the cabin, the fire burned the way it was supposed to burn when it was properly tended steadily without drama, giving off heat that reached every corner of the room. When morning came and the storm had passed and the world outside was white and still and new in the way that only the morning after a hard storm can be, Hargrove Ranch was exactly where it had always been in that valley between the mountains and the creek, honest and solid and still standing. And inside it, something had been said that could not be unsaid, and something had been decided that did not need to be decided again. The blizzard left 4 feet of snow in the valley and rendered the road to Cedar Falls impassable for 4 days. In those 4 days, Hargrove Ranch became something it had not been since Rose Hargrove was alive. It became a place where people were genuinely present with one another, rather than simply occupying the same structure between one set of chores and the next. The enforced closeness of a snowbound cabin has a way of dissolving the careful distances that people maintain by habit, the way a river in flood dissolves the careful boundaries of its banks. You cannot perform privacy when the walls are that thin and the hours are that long and there is nowhere to go. Eleanor played chess. She played it the way she did most things, with a patience that was strategic rather than passive, waiting for the shape of the board to tell her where the opportunity was, rather than trying to force one into being. She beat Rue 6 times in a row on the first afternoon, which Rue accepted with the equanimity of a man who has lost at things before and who understands that losing to someone better is simply a form of learning. He demanded a seventh game and lost that as well, and declared a moratorium until he had time to study the game more seriously. Beck played her on the second afternoon, and this was different. Beck played chess the way he managed accounts methodically ahead of the obvious move without sentiment about the pieces he sacrificed. Their game lasted 2 hours and ended in a draw, which was the first draw Beck had achieved in years, and which he acknowledged with a small nod that in Beck's vocabulary was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Cole watched from the chair by the window, ostensibly reading the almanac, which he could not have told you a single fact from had anyone asked. He was watching Eleanor think, the particular quality of her concentration when she was working something through, the way her expression did not change, but her eyes shifted in small increments, processing. He had seen that face in the barn on the first night, and on the hillside with her hand over his, and standing in the blizzard with a rope in her hand. It was the face she brought to everything that mattered to her, and he had begun to catalog the things that mattered to Eleanor Whitfield with the care of someone who understands they are learning something they do not want to have to learn again from the beginning. On the third day, the conversation went deeper, the way conversations do when the ordinary escapes are unavailable, and the silence would be too conspicuous. Eleanor told him about her mother. She had died when Eleanor was 12, of fever in the spring, and Eleanor had spent the summer afterward working beside her father in the barn, in a way that the neighboring families had found excessive for a girl of that age, and that her father had encouraged without apology because he understood what his daughter needed, which was not sympathy but occupation, and the reassurance that she was useful, and that the world still required things of her even now. She became a horsewoman because of that summer. She became most of what she was because of that summer. Cole told her about the war in more detail than he had told anyone. Not the battles, not the tactical particulars that men told when they wanted to talk about the war without talking about it, but the other things. The way sound changed in certain kinds of forests and what that change meant. The way a man's voice changed when he had been carrying something too long and the voice could no longer carry it at the same pitch it had started at. He told her about the morning he came back through the lines, and the place where Everett had been was empty, and the understanding of what that emptiness meant had arrived not as a single blow, but as a slow accumulation over the following hours, like water rising in a closed room. Eleanor listened with the quality of attention that he had identified on the wagon ride from Cedar Falls as her particular gift. The attention that does not require response, that understands the difference between telling and asking for an answer. "You have been waiting for everyone you cared about to leave," she said when he was done. Not a question, a diagnosis. Cole was quiet for a long moment. "That is one way to describe it. Is it wrong?" "No," he said. "It is not wrong." She looked at him across the cabin, across the chessboard, where Beck's abandoned game was still laid out across the stove, where Rue was heating water for coffee, with the focused attention of a man giving two people privacy by means of elaborate indifference. "I am not planning to leave," Eleanor said. It was not a declaration. It was information delivered in the same voice she used for information about mares and fence posts and water sources in winter. But Cole, who had learned to read the space between what Eleanor Whitfield said and how she said it, understood that it was also the most important thing she had said since the night of the storm. Harrington was still in Cedar Falls. This fact presented itself again in January when the road reopened and Rue made the supply run into town and came back with flour and coffee and the information that the lawyer and the two men were still installed in the Frontier House, running up a bill that suggested Harrington had either unlimited resources or unlimited confidence that the bill would shortly become someone else's problem. The three Hargrove brothers and Eleanor sat with this information at the kitchen table. Beck had in the intervening weeks done what Beck always did. He had prepared. He had written down everything he knew about Victor Harrington from the letter, and from what Eleanor had told him, organized it into a clear account of the facts, and had driven into Cedar Falls twice to speak with Marshal Conrad Tanner. Tanner was a man who had been in Montana territory long enough to have developed a thorough impatience with Eastern money that arrived believing it could purchase local outcomes. He was not hostile. He was simply clear the way a man is clear when he has thought carefully about what he believes and does not need to revise it under pressure. Tanner had told Beck that the marriage between Cole and Eleanor Hargrove was legally sound under Montana territorial law, and that no document Harrington could produce would alter that fundamental fact. He had also told Beck that he was watching the two men Harrington had brought with him because he was a marshal, and watching people whose behavior warranted watching was his function. What they did not have yet was anything that could move Harrington from a position of waiting into a position of having to leave. A man with money and lawyers and patience could wait a long time on a legal frontier, and waiting cost him far less than it cost the people he was waiting against. This was the calculation that had no solution yet. And then on a gray afternoon in March, when the snow was beginning to pull back from the south-facing slopes and the aspens on the hillside were thinking about leaves again, a hired coach appeared at the gate of Hargrove Ranch. The woman who stepped down from it was 58 years old and carried herself with the posture of someone who had once been accustomed to having her entrance noted and had somewhere along the way decided that the noting was less important than she had thought. She was dressed well but not elaborately, her coat the kind that a person buys for warmth rather than display her boots sensible. She looked at the ranch from the gate with an expression that was both assessing and something softer underneath the assessment, the expression of a person who has been imagining a place and is now reconciling the imagining with the reality. Eleanor had come out of the cabin when she heard the coach because Eleanor came out to see anything that arrived at the ranch, which was a habit of a woman who had learned not to be caught by surprise. She stood on the porch and looked at the woman at the gate and went completely still. Cole came out beside her. He saw Eleanor's face. "My aunt," Eleanor said. "Clara Whitfield." Cole looked at the woman by the gate, who was now looking back at them both with an expression that contained in roughly equal parts relief and uncertainty, and the particular controlled guilt of someone who has been working up to this moment for longer than anyone knows. Cole opened the porch gate and walked to meet her. He extended his hand. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I am Cole Hargrove, Eleanor's husband." Clara Whitfield took his hand and held it for a moment in both of hers. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "I came a long way. I hope that means something." "Come inside," he said. "It is cold to stand at a gate." The conversation inside the cabin did not begin easily. Easy was not what this kind of conversation was designed to be. Clara Whitfield sat across from her niece and said what she had come to say, which was that she had been wrong, which was perhaps the most expensive thing this particular woman had ever said aloud, because she was a woman who had built most of her life on the assurance that she knew what was best, and the admission that she had not was not a small revision. She said she had meant well. She said she believed this was true, and that it was also insufficient, and that the insufficiency of good intentions was something she had taken longer to understand than it should have taken her. She said Harrington had seemed to her to be opportunity in a form that she understood, and that she had not asked Eleanor what opportunity looked like from the inside of Eleanor's life, and that this was the failure from which everything else had followed. Eleanor listened. She did not make it easier, but she also did not make it harder. She waited for the whole of what her aunt had come to say, and when it was done, she looked at the woman across from her for a long moment. "You should have asked me," Eleanor said. "I should have," Clara said. "You knew you should have asked me, and you did not." "Yes. And you believed that what you wanted for me was more important than what I wanted for myself." Clara Whitfield sat with this. "I did. I was wrong." The silence in the cabin was the kind that follows a thing that has needed to be said for a long time and has now been said and cannot be unsaid. Rue had found something requiring his complete attention in the far corner of the room. Beck had stepped outside. Cole sat in the chair by the window with the almanac he was not reading present as a witness in the way that a person is present when presence itself is what is needed. Then Clara said, "There is something else I need to tell you about Harrington." Beck came back in from outside. He had known or suspected that there was more to this visit than the apology because Beck always suspected more, and Beck was almost never wrong about it. "He has done this before," Clara said. "Not here, in New Hampshire. Two families. I know one of them through a connection in Boston, a woman I have known for 15 years, who told me about it in confidence, and then agreed when I explained the situation to confirm it in writing." She set a folded document on the table. Harrington used the same approach. Legal pressure, documentation that was technically sufficient to generate a dispute, combined with men who could apply other kinds of pressure when the legal variety moved too slowly. She looked at Cole. Both families paid him to go away rather than fight a long, expensive legal battle in a jurisdiction where he had connections and they did not. Beck picked up the document and read it with the speed of a man who reads such things often. He looked at Cole. "This changes the calculation," Beck said. "Tanner needs to see this." "I have a second letter," Clara said, "from the other family. They have agreed to provide written confirmation as well if it is needed." Cole looked at the document in Beck's hands. He looked at Clara Whitfield, who had driven from Boston to Montana Territory in March, with letters in her coat that she had spent what was clearly several difficult weeks assembling. "Why?" he said, not in the sense of questioning her motives, but in the genuine sense of wanting to understand what had moved her from where she had been to here. Clara looked at him and then at Eleanor. "Because I sat in my house in Boston for 2 months after Eleanor left, and I told myself she would come back. And then she did not come back. And I began to dream badly, the kind of dreams that an old woman has when she knows she has done something that cannot be taken back and has not yet done anything to address it." She paused. "And because when Harrington came to me and asked whether I knew where she had gone, I told him nothing, which was the first correct thing I had done. And then I decided to come and do the second." Marshal Conrad Tanner read both letters in his office in Cedar Falls on a Thursday morning in the third week of March. He read them once and then he read them again, which was his method with documents that required his full understanding before he acted on them. He set them down on his desk and looked at Cole, who was sitting across from him in the only other chair. "The marriage is sound," Tanner said. "That was always true. Nothing he brought with him changes that. But this," he touched the letters, "is a different matter. This is a pattern Hargrove, and patterns are my business." He said he would need to be in contact with the relevant parties in New Hampshire, which would take time, but which would in the meanwhile change the position Harrington was in considerably. A man operating on the assumption that no one was comparing notes across state lines operated differently when that assumption was demonstrated to be incorrect. "I want him gone," Cole said. "Not eventually. Now." "I understand that," Tanner said. "I am going to see what I can do." What happened in Cedar Falls over the following week was not orchestrated. That is the essential thing to understand about it, because the unorchestrated quality of it was precisely what made it what it was. Cedar Falls was a town of 50 people in a territory where 50 people was enough to constitute a community, and communities in that territory operated by a set of understandings that predated the arrival of Eastern legal frameworks and would in all probability outlast them. People talked. Rue had been talking to people in Cedar Falls for a decade, not strategically, not as information management, but in the way that a person who genuinely cares about the people around him talks to them, remembering what they told him last time and asking about it this time and listening to the answer. When the story of Harrington and the New Hampshire letters moved through town, it moved through a network of people who already knew the Hargroves and had already formed opinions about the man installed in the frontier house, with his lawyer and his hired men, and the opinions they had formed were consistent. Agnes Cooper did not rearrange items outside her store. She stood squarely in her doorway. The blacksmith was at the front of his shop when Cole came through town. 3 ranchers from outlying properties who had been in Cedar Falls for supplies found reasons to remain in town for the afternoon. Reverend Hollis stood on the step of the church. None of this was coordinated. All of it was understood. Harrington came out of the frontier house in the middle of the afternoon on a day that had become unexpectedly public. He came out because waiting had stopped feeling like advantage and had started feeling like something else. And men like Harrington were not accustomed to a feeling that did not resolve in their favor within a predictable time frame. He looked at Cedar Falls as it stood that afternoon, a small street, a general store, a church, a blacksmith shop, 3 or 4 ranchers on the frontier house steps who had nowhere they needed to be and apparently no intention of being there soon. And at the far end of the street, in front of the marshal's office, Cole Hargrove standing beside Conrad Tanner with the posture of a man who has been in open country his whole life and knows how to stand in it. Harrington's 2 men stood behind him. They looked at the street and its arrangement of people, and they calculated the calculation that men in their profession calculate the ratio of the money they were being paid to the difficulty of the work required to earn it, measured against the availability of an easier option somewhere else. The numbers did not favor the current situation. Harrington said nothing that afternoon that was worth recording. He looked at the street for a long moment, and then he went back inside the frontier house. His coach was out front the following morning before most people in Cedar Falls were awake. By the time Agnes Cooper opened her store, the road to Denver was empty, and Victor Harrington was on it. He did not send letters. He did not return. He had encountered for perhaps the first time in his particular career of applied pressure, a situation in which the pressure had nowhere useful to go, and men of his type did not persist in unprofitable territory when other territories existed. Cedar Falls was a small town in a remote Montana valley, but it knew how to stand. She told him on a Tuesday evening in April after supper, after Beck and Rue had gone to check the late feeding, and the cabin was quiet the way it only got quiet when the work of the day had finished. She said it the way she said everything that mattered directly without preface, watching his face. He was quiet for a long moment, not from uncertainty, from the particular stillness of a man receiving something he has not allowed himself to anticipate, because anticipating it seemed like a form of presumption. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I am well," she said. "I wanted you to know before the doctor confirmed it. I wanted you to hear it from me." He looked at her across the table and said nothing else. He did not need to. Some things between them had stopped requiring words some weeks ago, and this was one of them. He reached across and covered her hand with his, and she turned hers over and held on, and they sat that way in the evening quiet of the cabin while the fire did what fires do when they are properly tended. Doc Silas Warren came to the ranch in late April for his regular visit, which had become genuinely regular rather than the provisional arrangement it had started as, because Silas Warren was a man who liked the Hargroves, and because Eleanor had become his most engaged reader of medical texts, and he had found that having someone to discuss them with improved his own thinking considerably. He examined Eleanor with the thoroughness of a doctor who takes his work seriously and the gentleness of one who has learned that the manner of examination is part of the examination. When he was done, he asked Cole to come in from the porch where he had been waiting with the particular careful stillness of a man who does not want to appear to be waiting. Doc Warren confirmed what they already knew, told them Eleanor was strong and healthy, said the timing was what he expected, and told them he wanted to be present when the time came, in late August or early September, and that he was prepared to make the arrangements necessary to ensure that. Cole said very little after Doc Warren left. He sat on the porch through the remainder of the afternoon, and Eleanor sat beside him, and they watched the sun go down over the West Ridge, in the way that they had begun to watch it together, not as a ritual, but as a habit, which was better than a ritual because it did not require remembering. He reached over and took her hand. She turned hers over and held his back. They sat like that until the last of the light was gone, and the stars began their particular occupation of the Montana sky, which was not subtle. Spring came to Hargrove Ranch with the particular quality of spring in mountain country, which is less a gradual warming than a negotiation cold, and warmth trading the days between them. Until one morning you step outside, and the South Slope meadow is green and the creek is running loud with snowmelt, and you understand that the negotiation is over and the outcome has been decided. Eleanor's garden plan, drafted in careful detail during the coldest weeks of January, was executed in April, with the systematic attention she brought to all her projects. Three sections: vegetables, culinary herbs, and medicinal plants, the last of which she had researched in the medical texts she had borrowed from Doc Warren and had not returned because she was still using them. Rue built the frame she specified. Beck dug the first section with an enthusiasm inversely proportional to his skill at digging and entirely consistent with his skill at everything else he committed to, which was to say he was thoroughly engaged and competent, regardless of how little he said about it. Cole watched the garden take shape the way he watched everything that was happening to his ranch in this new chapter of its life, with the awareness of a man who has been paying attention to the same piece of land for 35 years, and who can tell the difference between things growing and things being grown. Faith was being trained. Eleanor worked with the filly every morning in the corral with the methodical patience of a person who understood that a young horse was not a project to be rushed, but a relationship to be built, which required consistency above all other virtues. Faith had her mother's intelligence and something else besides a boldness that was her own, an interest in everything that moved, and several things that did not. She had also inherited her mother's talent for testing the limits of any enclosure, but Eleanor had anticipated this and was addressing it directly, which is to say she was teaching the filly that limits were not the enemy, but the frame within which genuine freedom was possible. Cole watched them work from the fence rail some mornings. He did not tell Eleanor what he was thinking when he watched. He did not need to, because Eleanor had developed the same ability to read his silences that he had developed for hers, and they communicated a great deal in the language of being near each other without requiring translation. Clara Whitfield had returned to Boston with the intention of attending to her affairs there. She wrote twice in April letters that came to Eleanor, in which Eleanor read at the kitchen table with a care that told Cole something about what the letters contained without his needing to ask. The second letter made her put it down and look out the window for a while before she folded it and set it in the small chest she kept in the corner of the bedroom. "She wants to come back," Eleanor said that evening after supper. Cole looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Not to the ranch," Eleanor said. "To Cedar Falls. She says there is a house for rent on the South Street. She says she would like to be nearby." "What do you want?" Cole said. Eleanor thought about this with the seriousness she brought to things that required it. "I want a family near," she said finally. "I did not know how much I wanted that until recently." Cole set down the harness and looked at his wife across the kitchen table. "Then write her back," he said. The summer was the fullest the ranch had known since the years when Josiah and Rose were both alive. The garden came in better than the most optimistic estimates because Eleanor had researched the soil and the drainage and the orientation to the sun with the thoroughness of a person who does not believe in leaving outcomes to chance when preparation is available. The tomatoes grew fat on stakes that Rue had built with the enthusiasm of someone who is very willing to build things when someone else tells him precisely how to build them. The medicinal section produced chamomile and yarrow and two varieties of mint and a stand of echinacea that Doc Warren inspected on his next visit with the approval of a man who recognizes competent botany. Faith was becoming a horse, not a foal anymore, but a young mare with opinions about how things should be done and enough intelligence to express those opinions in ways that were not destructive, but were very definitely communicative. Eleanor was teaching her to accept the weight of a saddle blanket, then the saddle itself patiently and without urgency, because Eleanor understood that you cannot hurry a thing that requires trust, and that trying to hurry it only teaches the animal that your patience has a limit, which is the one thing you do not want a horse to know. Cole watched Faith and Eleanor in the corral and thought about what he saw there about the way that patience applied consistently becomes trust, and the way that trust built carefully becomes the foundation for everything that follows. He thought about this more than he would have admitted to anyone. Clara Whitfield arrived in Cedar Falls in early July and moved into the house on the South Street, which was small and needed a great deal of work, which she addressed with the energy of a woman who had been living in a large, empty house for many years and had a great deal of industry stored up that had not found sufficient application. She came to the ranch twice a week, and on her visits, she and Eleanor worked together in the garden or in the kitchen and talked in the way that two people talk when they are rebuilding something that was broken and have decided the rebuilding is worth the effort. Cole treated Clara Whitfield with the same directness he brought to everyone politely, honestly, and without sentiment he did not feel. Over the course of the summer, he found that he felt more of it than he had anticipated. She was when not operating under the anxiety of a woman who believed she was managing her niece's best interests, a person of considerable intelligence and dry humor and a capacity for candor that he respected. She had grown up on a farm before Boston had gotten hold of her, and the farm knowledge was still there, imperfectly remembered but genuine, and Eleanor delighted in finding it, and the delight was something Cole liked to watch. The summer was full and it was good, and it was the kind of life that a man who has been waiting for his life to become something could recognize when it was finally becoming it. Doc Warren arrived at the ranch on the 26th of August and set himself up with the methodical preparation of a man who has attended enough difficult situations to know that preparation is the only variable he can control. The supplies he had brought were organized with the experienced precision of 30 years of practice. Clara Whitfield arrived the day after and communicated to everyone present without needing to say it directly that she intended to be of use and that her presence was not negotiable. Rue and Beck continued their work. Rue somewhat louder than usual, which was his response to uncertainty. Beck somewhat quieter than usual, which was his response to everything. Eleanor worked alongside Cole through those last days of August in the way that she had worked alongside him all year steadily without drama, doing what needed to be done with the full attention she brought to anything she considered worth doing. She adjusted her movements without complaint, simply noting what was required and providing it. On the night of the 29th of August, the labor began. Cole was sent to the porch. He understood why. Eleanor had been clear about this weeks earlier, direct in the way she was direct about everything. She did not want him to see her in the middle of it because she was not a performance, and the middle of it was not a thing she wished to have witnessed. He understood this because it was entirely consistent with who she was, and he would not have argued with it even if he had wanted to, which he did not. He sat on the porch. Rue sat beside him after half an hour, because Rue could not leave a person alone on a porch at night if that person was carrying weight. He brought 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Cole and sat down and did the thing that was hardest for Rue, which was to be quiet. He managed it mostly. He said 2 or 3 things over the course of several hours, small observations about the stars and the temperature, things that required no response and were not asking for one. He was simply marking time in the only way he knew that had warmth in it. Beck walked the yard, not pacing exactly, more the way a man moves when his body needs to be in motion, because stillness has become an unreasonable demand. He covered the same circuit from the cabin to the barn to the fence and back over and over in the same steady rhythm, and every time he came around to the porch, he looked at Cole and did not say anything, which was everything. Reverend Hollis had driven out from Cedar Falls in the late afternoon because someone had sent word, which meant Rue had sent word, and the Reverend sat in the chair inside the cabin near the door and prayed in the quiet way he did everything without display. The hours moved. Doc Warren came out once at the beginning of the second hour, and his face had a quality that Cole had learned to read accurately in the years since the war, which was the face of a person managing more information than he is sharing. He said that Eleanor was working hard and that Clara was with her and that things were proceeding. He said the word proceeding with the care of a man choosing a word for its precision rather than its comfort. Cole looked at him. "She is strong," Warren said. "I have told you that before, and it remains true." "Do what you need to do," Cole said. "All of it." Warren nodded and went back inside. The third hour was the longest hour Cole Hargrove had lived since a field in Virginia in 1863. He sat on the porch and he looked at the mountains, and he said the things that a man says when he has run out of other resources, not formally, not with ceremony, but with the directness that he brought to everything he meant. He was not sure in that moment whether anyone was listening to such things. He had not been sure for many years, but the uncertainty had never seemed like a good reason not to try. He said, "Let her be all right. I will manage the rest." Then from inside the cabin a sound, small, thin, the sound of something that has just been introduced to the world and has opinions about it that it intends to express immediately. Rue made a sound beside him that was not a word. He pressed his hand over his mouth. Beck appeared at the corner of the cabin and stopped walking. The sound from inside continued for a moment and then quieted, and the quiet that followed it was the most significant quiet Cole Hargrove had ever sat inside, because it was the quiet of a room that was deciding something, and he was outside it and could not see which way the decision was going. He waited. The door opened. Doc Warren stood in it. His face had the quality it had not had on his last appearance. It was clear. The control he had been applying to it was no longer required. "Come in," he said. "Both of them are fine." Rue made the sound again, and this time did not try to stop it. Beck turned away from the porch for a moment and faced the dark yard. His shoulders rose and fell once slowly. Cole stood up from the chair where he had been sitting for 3 hours and walked to the door and went inside. The lamp in the bedroom made the light the color of old honey. Clara Whitfield sat in the corner chair with her hands in her lap and her eyes red-rimmed, and her expression the expression of a woman who has been present for something and has not yet finished understanding it. She looked at Cole when he came in and nodded once, and that nod contained more than it could have held in any quantity of words. Eleanor was in the bed. She had the appearance of a person who has given every resource she had to a single effort and is only now beginning to take stock of the fact that the effort is over. She was pale in the way that goes past ordinary pale, and her hair was damp and pushed back from her face, and she held in her arms a bundle of cloth that was moving. She looked at Cole when he came through the door, and the thing in her face was not triumph and not relief, and not even happiness in any simple sense. It was something that had no convenient name, the particular expression of a person who has come through something real and is on the other side of it and is looking at the person who waited for them there. "Come here," she said. Her voice was reduced to its essential register, the voice that remains when everything non-essential has been used up. "Come and see her." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at his daughter. She was very small. She had dark hair, which surprised him and also did not, because he had dark hair and there was a logic to it. Her eyes were open, the unfocused eyes of a brand new person who is receiving an enormous quantity of information and has not yet developed the filing system to manage it. She was looking at the approximate direction of his face with an attention that seemed, against all reasonable expectation, entirely serious. "What is her name?" he said. His voice did not come out at its usual pitch. "Grace," Eleanor said. "I would like her to be Grace, and for her middle name—" She paused, and he could hear the consideration in the pause rose. "For your mother, if you would like that." Cole looked at his daughter, at the dark hair and the serious eyes and the small hands that were at this precise moment gripping the edge of the blanket with a determination entirely disproportionate to her hours of existence. Grace Rose Hargrove. He said it in his mind. He let it settle into the same place where the name Faith had settled, and the name Eleanor, and the name Hargrove Ranch, as it was now, which was different from the same name as it had been a year ago. "My mother would have liked that very much," he said. His voice was what it was, and he did not try to make it anything else. Eleanor reached over and covered his hand with hers, the same gesture she had used on the hillside months ago. The gesture that was not sentiment, but acknowledgement. The gesture that said, "This is real, and I know it is real, and I am here with you in the knowing of it." Grace Rose Hargrove blinked at the lamplight with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and is taking her time deciding what she thinks of it. Cedar Falls came to the ranch in the days that followed, not in a group, not by arrangement, but in the way that people come when they want to come and do not need a reason beyond wanting. Agnes Cooper arrived on the second day with enough food for 2 weeks, organized in a sequence that accounted for what kept longest and what needed to be used first, because Agnes Cooper's competence expressed itself in food the way Beck's expressed itself in numbers. She stood at the kitchen door and handed it in and looked at Eleanor, who was sitting by the fire, and said, "You are one of us now." She said it not as a welcome, but as a statement of fact that had been true for some time and was now simply being noted aloud. The blacksmith's wife came with a quilt that had taken her 4 months to make. Reverend Hollis came with his blessing and stayed for coffee. 3 ranching families from the outlying properties sent representatives with gifts that were practical jars of preserved goods, a sack of flour, a length of good wool. Rue held Grace with the comfort of someone who had been born knowing how to be trusted with something small and important. He talked to her about the ranch, describing it in considerable detail because he felt she deserved to understand where she had arrived. He was confident she was listening. Beck made no claims about the infant's comprehension, but sat near her with a proximity and care that communicated what he was not going to say directly. Clara Whitfield moved between the kitchen and the bedroom and the porch with the efficiency of a woman who has found her function and is applying it. She told Eleanor stories about Eleanor's mother, small ones, particular ones, the kind that are only available to someone who knew the person before she became a mother and remembers who she was before she became that. Eleanor listened to these stories with the attention she had given everything that mattered to her, and her face during the listening was the face of a person receiving something she had not known she needed. The days lengthened into weeks and the weeks into the season turning, and Grace Rose Hargrove grew with the steady vigor of something that has decided from the beginning that it intends to be present in the world. On a Thursday afternoon in the first week of October, Cole stood at the kitchen window and watched Eleanor walk up the hill. Grace was on her hip, 15 months old, objecting to this mode of transport with the physical expressiveness of a child who has opinions about how she would prefer to be carried and has not yet accepted that the opinion is not final. Eleanor adjusted her grip without commentary and continued up the path toward the aspen grove, and Grace subsided into the observation of the landscape, which was by any objective measure worth observing. Cole put on his coat and followed them. The aspens were turning. They did this with a commitment that the aspens in other places did not quite match, going from green to yellow to gold in a progression that took perhaps 2 weeks and then was over until next year. In those 2 weeks, the hillside above Hargrove Ranch looked like something that a painter would not have attempted because no one would believe it. Eleanor was standing before the 3 markers when Cole came through the last of the trees. Grace was seated on the ground in front of Rose Hargrove's marker, engaged with a cluster of dried wildflowers that had survived the early cold. She was attempting to eat one of them. Eleanor removed it from her hand with the calm competence of a parent who has accepted that objects and mouths have an attraction for each other that cannot be argued with, only managed. She took the flower and placed it against the base of the marker instead. Cole stood beside her. Below them, the valley, the cabin with its stone chimney beginning to breathe smoke in the afternoon cool. The barn, the garden done for the year, the frame standing empty now but waiting. Hunter Creek, where it bent around the south end of the property, catching the afternoon light, the way it always caught it, silver and cold and constant. The horses in the near corral, Faith among them, grown now into something that turned heads at the Cedar Falls stockyard, which was exactly what Eleanor had told him she would become on the night she was born. "The ranch is talking today," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "That is what you do," she said. "When you look at it from up here, you listen to what it is saying." "Yes," he said. "I suppose I do." "What is it saying?" Cole looked at the valley for a moment. "It says the people who tend it care about it," he said. He was using her words, the words she had said to him on the same hill almost a year ago, standing in front of the same marker. He said them back to her now, not as repetition, but as confirmation. The same sentence revised by 12 months of evidence. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him with the green eyes that had swept the Cedar Falls platform in November of last year, with the assessing gaze of a scout, and that were looking at him now with no assessment in them at all. Nothing strategic or careful or held in reserve. "I am glad I came here," she said. Cole looked at his wife and his daughter in the valley that his father had built and his mother had made into a home, and that was for the first time since he could remember fully what it was supposed to be. "So am I," he said. Grace, having reconsidered the flower situation and found it to her disadvantage, reached upward with both arms in the direction of the nearest available adult, which was Cole. He picked her up. She immediately transferred her attention to the brim of his hat, which she gripped with both hands, and pulled sideways with the confidence of someone who has determined that hats are improved by reorientation. He let her have the hat. Eleanor watched this with the expression that had appeared on her face sometime in the last year, in which Cole had decided was the truest expression she had, the one underneath all the other ones, the one that was not performing anything for anyone. Rue was somewhere below them, visible as a small figure near the barn, doing something with a fence post that was probably unnecessary, but which he had clearly decided was necessary, which amounted to the same thing. Beck was at the kitchen table, most likely with the account books that told the story of the ranch in numbers, adding this season's numbers to the long account. The aspen leaves moved in the light wind. A hawk turned slow circles above the south ridge. Cole stood on the hill that held his family and held his daughter, and stood next to his wife, and looked at the land that had not lied about any of it, and felt the particular weight of a man who has been carrying something long enough that he has forgotten what it felt like not to carry it, setting that thing down. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way a man sets down a weight when he has arrived at the place where the weight was meant to go. 3 years later, autumn 1876. Grace Rose Hargrove was 3 years old and had decided opinions about most things. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and a combination of their separate stubbornnesses that produced something that was genuinely its own. She had also inherited from some unidentifiable source a quality of pure fearlessness that kept Eleanor and Cole in a permanent state of alert and delighted Rue beyond any reasonable measure. She had walked into Faith's stall at 18 months old and introduced herself to the mare, as though this was a social call she had been meaning to make for some time, and Faith, who was now a horse of particular distinction in the region, had received the introduction with the gravity it deserved. There was also Fletcher Hargrove, 8 months old, who had arrived in the spring with considerably less difficulty than his sister, and who had so far expressed himself primarily through sleeping eating, and a series of facial expressions of varying skepticism that Beck found professionally relatable. Reuben Hargrove had married in the summer. Adeline was the blacksmith's daughter, a young woman who had known Rue for years with the patient amusement of someone who has always understood that certain people need to grow into what they already are, and who had decided sometime in the previous winter that the growing was sufficiently advanced. Their wedding had been held in the Cedar Falls Church, with half the valley present. Beck had given a 4-sentence speech that the assembled guests remembered in its entirety afterward, which is all that can be said about a wedding speech that matters. Beck was still single as far as anyone could tell. He was also, as far as anyone could tell, studying law through a correspondence course offered out of Cheyenne. Cole had found the text in Beck's room by accident and had said one word about it, the word good, and had left the room. The course would take 2 more years. No one in the family doubted he would complete it. Clara Whitfield had become a person of Cedar Falls, in the way that people become part of a place when they stop performing the role of a visitor and start doing the actual work of being present. She taught music to the children on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the room behind the church. She helped organize the winter supply drive for families who had hard years. She brought food to sick neighbors without being asked. She was not a person of Boston anymore, and she did not behave as one, and the town received her as what she was, which was a woman who had decided at 58 that the place she had arrived at was the place she intended to stay. She came to the ranch every Sunday without exception, and on the Sundays when the weather made the road difficult, she came anyway, and she sat at the kitchen table and ate with the 4, sometimes 6, sometimes 7 of them, and was part of the conversation in the way of a person who has figured out how to be present without requiring the arrangement of things around her. Harrington had not written. He had not sent lawyers. He had not reappeared in any form that anyone could detect. A man of his particular type moves on when the territory stops producing what he came for, and Cedar Falls had made its position sufficiently clear that the possibility of productive territory was no longer on the table. The matter had resolved itself the way matters sometimes resolve when the people on one side of them are simply not willing to be moved, which is not dramatically but permanently. Faith of Hargrove Ranch, as she appeared in the breeding records that were now consulted by ranchers from 3 counties, had produced her first foal in the previous spring, a roan colt that had the look of something serious, and her second was expected in the late spring of '77. Eleanor had built the breeding program with the same methodical patience she brought to everything else, starting from the knowledge she had arrived with and adding to it through observation and reading and the willingness to be wrong and correct the error and try again. The Hargrove horses were not yet famous. They were becoming known, which is the stage that precedes everything else and which takes longer and means more. The garden was twice the size it had been in the first year, occupying the south and east plots behind the cabin with the confidence of something that has been properly established. Eleanor had taught Rue the medicinal section. She was teaching Grace the names of the herbs which Grace applied herself to with the seriousness of a student who has decided this information is worth having. On a Sunday morning in the middle of October, with the aspen grove burning gold against the blue sky and the creek running low and clear in the cold, Eleanor stood in the garden with her daughter beside her and her son on her hip and her Aunt Clara at the fence, and she looked at the ranch the way Cole had always looked at it from the hill, with the attention of someone who is listening to what it has to say. It said, "You are home." She had known this for some time. She had known it, she thought, since the morning after Faith was born, standing at the pump in the cold, with her hands still cramped from the work of the night, and the valley beginning its color in the east, and the knowledge settling into her that this was the place, and these were the people, and this was the life she had not known she was looking for when she answered a 2-paragraph advertisement in a newspaper in her aunt's sitting room in Boston. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because of what she had found, which was more than she had known to ask for. A person who is built the way Eleanor Hargrove was built does not often say things like this aloud, because saying it aloud is not her way of knowing it. She knows it in the doing, in the morning work, in the evening fire, and the particular quality of walking beside a person who matches your stride without asking you to change it. But she said it to Clara that morning quietly, while Grace investigated a frost-killed tomato plant with the thoroughness of a scientist. "I am glad I came here," Eleanor said. Clara Whitfield looked at her niece in the October morning in the garden she had built on the ranch she had helped make into what it was, with the daughter who had her eyes and the son who had her husband's jaw, and the husband who had been from the beginning, exactly who he had described himself as in 2 paragraphs in a Denver newspaper, which was to say honest and hardworking and in need of a partner rather than a prize. "Your mother would say she is not surprised," Clara said. "She always said you knew where you were going, even when you did not know where you were going." Eleanor picked a late rosemary sprig from the herbs section and turned it in her fingers. It was dry and still fragrant, holding its oil against the cold, with the particular stubbornness of plants that have adapted to difficult conditions. She thought this was a good description of several things she knew. Grace said something that was probably a question. Eleanor answered it directly in the way that she answered everything, without simplifying it past the point of accuracy. Grace considered the answer. She appeared to find it satisfactory. The morning continued. The creek ran. The horses moved in the far corral with the unhurried purpose of creatures that know they are safe and well kept and have nowhere particular to be. Faith stood at the fence and watched Eleanor with the dark, intelligent eyes of a horse that remembers who was present on the first night of her life and has not forgotten it. Cole came out of the barn and saw his wife and his daughter in the garden and his son on her hip and his wife's aunt at the fence. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment. He looked at the ranch his father had built and his mother had made a home, and that 3 years of careful, patient daily work had turned into something that was both those things and also a third thing that neither of his parents had seen in it, a thing that required exactly the combination of people who were now living on it to exist at all. He pulled on his coat and walked toward the garden. Hargrove Ranch sat where it had always sat, in the valley between the mountains and the creek, honest and solid and still standing. It had told the truth from the beginning to anyone who had been willing to listen. The land never lies about what it is, and it never lies about the people who choose to stay on it. It said this is what it looks like when people decide to build something together. It said this is what remains when the storm has passed. It said, come in, you are home.